President Trump is preparing what his administration is calling an economic D-Day against Iran. Washington says this next round of sanctions could be the toughest economic measures ever imposed on Tehran. But this time, America isn't targeting Iran alone. The message from Washington is much broader. If you continue helping Iran, you could become a target too. This puts one country directly in the spotlight, China, because China buys more than 80% of Iran's exported oil. The question is no longer simply whether America can hurt Iran's economy. The bigger question is whether Washington can pressure Iran without triggering a much larger confrontation with Beijing. There is another problem. Iran is already under enormous economic pressure. Its oil exports have been severely disrupted, and the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily restricted. Inside Iran, senior officials are openly talking about the need to end the war. At the same time, Iran's military leadership is warning that any new American pressure could trigger a devastating response. So what exactly is Trump trying to accomplish? And can economic warfare succeed where military pressure has not? I'm Julian Brooks, and this is Global Insight Report. The phrase economic D-Day sounds dramatic, and that is exactly the point. President Trump has promised a major escalation in economic pressure. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said the United States will impose what he calls the toughest sanctions in history. The administration's objective is clear: reduce Iran's ability to generate revenue, restrict its access to international finance, target companies doing business with Tehran, and force the Iranian leadership back toward Washington's negotiating position. But there is a major difference between sanctions and military strikes. A bomb can destroy a facility in seconds. A sanction tries to make economic activity increasingly difficult until the target government is forced to change its behavior. That can take months or years. Iran has lived under sanctions for decades, so Washington is making a big bet that the combination of military pressure, a naval blockade, and economic isolation can finally force Tehran to make concessions. The American strategy is easy to understand. Think of it as a 1-2 punch. The first part is military pressure. The second is economic pressure. The naval blockade has already disrupted Iranian oil exports. Now, Washington wants to tighten the financial side. Bessent suggested that maximum economic pressure could reduce the need for another military escalation. In other words, if sanctions can squeeze Iran hard enough, perhaps America won't have to launch another major offensive. That is strategically attractive, but carries enormous risks. Economic pressure can force a government to negotiate, or it can convince that government that it has nothing left to lose. One leads to diplomacy, the other leads to escalation. To understand the strategy, we have to understand Iran's oil. It is the country's most important source of hard currency. Revenue from oil supports government finances and sustains the economic system. If Washington can prevent Iran from selling oil, it attacks Tehran's most important economic lifeline. That appears to be happening. Iranian crude offers to Chinese buyers have declined as the American blockade disrupts shipments. Reuters reports that Iranian exports have fallen dramatically, with August estimates around 534,000 barrels per day, compared with 1.4 million in 2025. This tells us the strategy is having an effect. The question is whether it will change Iran's political calculations. Here, the story becomes bigger than Iran. China is Iran's most important oil customer. According to Reuters, more than 80% of Iran's exported oil goes to Chinese buyers. This means Washington faces a dilemma. To isolate Iran, it has to deal with China. But China is a global economic power and America's biggest competitor. Beijing has made its position clear. China says unilateral American sanctions are not the solution and is calling for diplomacy. The American strategy could create a second, potentially more dangerous confrontation, Washington versus Beijing. The question Washington must answer is, how far is America willing to go? If a Chinese company continues buying Iranian oil, does Washington sanction it? If a major Chinese bank facilitates the transaction, does America target the bank? This is no longer simply an Iran policy. It becomes a test of American economic power. For decades, the dollar has given the United States enormous financial leverage. Washington is betting this leverage will be enough. But China has its own economic power and has strong reasons not to surrender without a fight. Iranian officials are already pushing back. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi mocked Washington's new economic threats, pointing out that Iran has experienced maximum pressure before and survived. Economic pain and political surrender are not the same thing. A government can become poorer without becoming more willing to compromise. Sometimes economic pressure strengthens hardliners, creates a siege mentality, and convinces leaders that negotiating under pressure would look like capitulation. That is exactly the risk Washington faces. Something unusual is happening inside Iran. There are signs of growing pressure within the Iranian leadership. President Masoud Pezeshkian has said that it may be time to end the war, arguing that Iran can do so from a position of strength. Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf also emphasized balancing military resistance with economic stability. This shows that the economic consequences are becoming a political issue inside Iran. If economic pressure creates enough internal disagreement, Tehran could eventually decide that negotiation is preferable to continued confrontation. But Iran's military is sending a different signal. They have warned that new American threats could trigger a devastating response. Tehran is communicating two things at the same time. The political leadership can talk about ending the war, but the military wants Washington to understand that Iran still has the ability to retaliate. In fact, a government under extreme pressure may become more willing to use the tools it still has, which is why sanctions are never risk-free. Hormuz is the bridge between the economic and military sides of this crisis. The United States wants Iran to reopen the strait. Iran has used control over the waterway as source of leverage, and the economic consequences are enormous. When shipping through Hormuz falls, energy markets react and prices rise. There is a contradiction. The more pressure Washington applies, the greater the incentive for Tehran to use Hormuz as leverage. That creates a dangerous cycle. If the campaign causes oil prices to rise significantly, the United States will feel the consequences. Higher crude prices mean higher gasoline prices, higher transportation costs, and potentially more inflation. American consumers don't experience sanctions as a treasury document. They experience geopolitical crises at the gas pump. If oil remains elevated, the debate changes. The question is no longer, are sanctions hurting Iran? It becomes, how much are Americans willing to pay for that pressure? Despite risks, we shouldn't underestimate the power of sanctions. Iran's economy is already under stress. If Washington successfully blocks financial channels, the pressure could become much more severe. Iran does not have unlimited financial reserves. Eventually, something has to give. The theory is not simply punishment, but creating leverage, making the cost of refusing a deal higher than the cost of accepting one. Iran appears to believe that time can work in its favor. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the political cost for Washington over military involvement and oil prices. Tehran may believe that Washington will eventually return to negotiations, allowing Iran to negotiate from a stronger position. China gives Iran an economic lifeline. If Chinese companies find ways around American sanctions, the pressure becomes less effective. The next round of American sanctions may be a real test, not of what happens in Tehran, but of what happens in Beijing. China has reasons for resisting American pressure, starting with energy security and strategic competition. Beijing does not want Washington deciding which countries China can trade with, but China also has limits. Chinese companies don't want to lose access to American financial markets or face secondary sanctions. So Beijing is likely to calculate carefully how far Washington is willing to go. The United Arab Emirates has suspended commercial dealings with Iran. That matters because the UAE has been an important economic gateway for Tehran. If Tehran loses access to both the UAE and China major channels, the pressure becomes much greater. Iran's regional environment is changing as countries become more cautious and Gulf states prioritize stability and trade. But there is a danger for Washington. If the United States pushes too far, it could create a coalition against its sanctions rather than against Iran. Other countries could decide that developing alternative financial networks is in their long-term interest. That's the paradox of sanctions. Used too aggressively, other countries may build systems designed to reduce American leverage. The Trump administration appears to believe economic pressure can replace military action. History shows that economic pressure rarely works instantly. Sometimes governments adapt or seek new partners. The next few weeks could tell us whether America's economic strategy is genuinely different this time, or simply another version of a strategy Iran has learned to survive. How would we know if Trump's strategy is working? We should watch key indicators, not speeches. Falling Iranian oil exports, collapsing Iranian currency, a collapse in Chinese imports of Iranian crude, and Tehran suddenly becoming more interested in direct negotiations. Real behavior matters. Failure would look very different. Iran continues resisting, China continues buying, Hormuz remains restricted, oil prices stay elevated, and Iran retaliates. This creates a cycle of more pressure, more resistance, more retaliation. If economic warfare triggers military escalation, the strategy has failed its most important objective. For Americans, the answer depends on what happens to oil. Transportation costs affect almost every part of the economy. Agriculture depends on transportation and fuel. An energy shock can spread through the economy, becoming an American economic story. The midterm elections are approaching. A president can withstand criticism over foreign policy, but rising gasoline prices are harder to explain to voters. If Americans feel effects at the pump while Iran continues resisting, the narrative could change. Iran only needs to make the war politically expensive. So where does this go from here? I see three possibilities. First, economic pressure succeeds and Tehran returns to negotiations. Second, Iran survives the pressure and the conflict becomes a prolonged economic confrontation. Third, escalation, where the Gulf becomes more dangerous, oil prices rise sharply, and economic warfare becomes military confrontation once again. What happens if China refuses to cooperate? If Washington punishes Chinese companies, the consequences extend far beyond Iran, affecting global trade, financial markets, and US-China relations. The real question is, who else is Washington willing to punish? Trump believes economic pain can create political leverage, while Iran believes it can survive. Both sides think time is on their side. When two governments believe they can outlast each other, compromise becomes harder, and every additional day increases the economic cost. Over the next few days, watch the details of the new American sanctions, China's response, Iran's response, oil prices, and the Strait of Hormuz. Those indicators will tell us far more than any speech. Washington wants Iran to make concessions, while Iran refuses to surrender. This language makes compromise harder. Any eventual agreement cannot be presented as an Iranian surrender or an American retreat, but as a negotiated settlement. This is a test of American economic power, Iranian resilience, and China's willingness to challenge Washington. Whatever happens next could shape how future governments use economic warfare. The next few days could tell us whether Trump's economic D-Day becomes a turning point or simply another chapter in a conflict that refuses to end. The real measure of success won't be the size of the sanctions or the rhetoric, but what happens afterward. I'm Julian Brooks, and this has been Global Insight Report. Stay informed.